Sir Edward, a titan of industry, had everything except a child. His wife, Lady Eleanor, had always yearned for a family. After years of unsuccessful attempts, she presented a drastic proposal: a second wife. Edward, initially resistant, relented, hoping to fulfill his wife's longing. The second wife, a young, vibrant woman named Juliet, quickly became pregnant. A year later, she gave birth to a healthy boy, Edward Jr. Eleanor, despite her initial joy at the birth, felt a pang of jealousy. She had longed for a child of her own, and now, it seemed, her desire had been granted to another. Months later, a miracle happened. Eleanor, to her and Edward's astonishment, became pregnant. The birth of their son, Thomas, brought immense happiness. But for Eleanor, it also ignited a dangerous obsession. She saw Edward Jr. not as her stepson, but as a rival, a threat to her son's inheritance. One evening, Eleanor confronted Edward. "We need to talk about Edward Jr.," she began, her voice filled with a chilling intensity. "He's growing older, and it's becoming clear that he poses a threat to Thomas's future." Edward was taken aback. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice laced with confusion. "He's your son. He has a right to be here. He's part of our family," he protested. Eleanor scoffed. "A part of our family? He's a threat to our family. He's a rival to Thomas. He must go." Edward's face hardened. "I won't allow you to do that," he said firmly. "Edward Jr. is my son, and I love him." Eleanor's eyes narrowed. "Then you must choose," she said, her voice low and menacing. "Either him or Thomas." Edward was torn. He loved both his sons, but he knew that Eleanor was capable of anything to protect her own. In the end, he made a heartbreaking decision. He agreed to Eleanor's plan, but on one condition. Edward Jr. would be sent away to a boarding school, far from their home. As Edward Jr. was packed off to the boarding school, Eleanor's heart swelled with a sense of triumph. She had won. Her son, Thomas, would one day inherit his father's empire, and nothing would stand in his way. But as she watched her stepson disappear into the distance, a small voice inside her whispered a warning. Her victory might not be as complete as she thought. Eleanor paced back and forth in the opulent living room, her face contorted with anger. "You agreed to it! You let me convince you!" she hissed, her voice echoing off the high ceilings. Edward sighed, his eyes filled with weariness. "Eleanor, I know you were upset, but—" "Upset?" she interrupted, her voice rising. "Upset? I was desperate, Edward. I wanted a child, and you couldn't give me one, so I had to resort to this." "Juliet has been nothing but respectful to you," Edward countered, trying to calm her down. "She's never tried to replace you." Eleanor scoffed. "Respectful? She's taken your love away from me. She's taken my place in this house." Edward shook his head. "That's not true, Eleanor. You're still the mistress of this house. And Juliet loves you. She respects you." Eleanor's eyes narrowed. "Love me? Respect me? She's a snake, Edward. She's only after your money." Edward sighed. "I don't believe that. Juliet loves me, and she loves our son." Eleanor's anger began to subside, replaced by a sense of hopelessness. I just want what's best for Thomas, she murmured. Edward reached out and took her hand. I know you do, and I promise I'll do everything I can to protect him. Eleanor's eyes narrowed, a dangerous glint in them. Edward's words of comfort fell on deaf ears. She knew that mere words wouldn't secure her position or her son's future. She needed to take more drastic measures. I need to think, she murmured, pulling away from Edward and pacing across the room. Her mind raced, searching for a solution. Eleanor's plan was simple but effective. She would frame Edward Jr. for bad behavior at school. If she could convince Edward that his son was a troublemaker, he would lose faith in him and be less likely to support him. She began by writing anonymous letters to the school, accusing Edward Jr. of bullying, vandalism, and academic dishonesty. She even went so far as to plant evidence in his locker, such as a stolen textbook and a note threatening a classmate. When the school received the complaints, they were alarmed. Edward Jr. was a model student, always polite and respectful, but the evidence against him was compelling. The school called Edward in for a meeting. He was shocked and devastated to hear the accusations. He tried to defend his son, but the evidence seemed overwhelming. Eleanor watched from the sidelines, a satisfied smile on her face. She had succeeded. Edward was beginning to doubt his son, but Edward Jr. was not going to give up without a fight. He knew he was innocent, and he was determined to prove it. He started by talking to his teachers and classmates, asking them if they had seen him behaving badly. To his relief, everyone denied the accusations. His teachers praised him for his hard work and good behavior. His classmates said he was a kind and friendly boy. Edward Jr. then approached the school principal and presented his evidence. He showed the principal the anonymous letters and the planted evidence and explained how he believed Eleanor was behind it. The principal was impressed by Edward Jr.'s intelligence and honesty. He agreed to investigate the matter further. After a thorough investigation, the principal concluded that the accusations against Edward Jr. were false. He apologized to the boy for the ordeal he had been through. Eleanor was furious when she heard the news. Her plan had failed. Edward Jr. was still a beloved student, and Edward continued to have faith in him. Eleanor realized that she would have to find another way to get rid of Edward Jr. She knew she couldn't do it alone. She would need help. Eleanor paced nervously in her opulent living room, her mind racing. She had failed to discredit Edward Jr. at school, and now her plan to rid herself of him seemed doomed. She needed help, and she knew just who to turn to. The next day, Eleanor met her friend, Lady Amelia, at a discreet tea house. Amelia was a woman of considerable wealth and influence, and she had a reputation for getting what she wanted. "Eleanor, my dear, what's wrong?" Amelia asked, her voice laced with concern. Eleanor poured out her heart to her friend, telling her about her failed plan and her desperation to get rid of Edward Jr. Amelia listened attentively, her eyes narrowing. "This is a serious matter, Eleanor," she said, "but I believe I can help you." She pulled out a small leather-bound notebook from her handbag. "This is a list of people who owe me favors. I believe one of them could be of use to you." Eleanor's eyes lit up with hope. "Really?" she asked eagerly. Amelia nodded. Yes. There's a man named Mr. Thorne. He's a private investigator with a reputation for being ruthless. I believe he could help you get rid of Edward Jr. Eleanor's heart pounded with excitement. How do I contact him? She asked. Amelia handed her a small card. This is his number. Call him and tell him I sent you. He'll know what to do. Eleanor thanked her friend and left the tea house, her mind racing with possibilities. She knew that hiring Mr. Thorne would be expensive, but she was willing to pay any price to get rid of Edward Jr. Eleanor dialed the number on the card, her heart pounding in her chest. She had never done anything like this before, and she was both excited and terrified. Hello, a deep, gravelly voice answered. Is this Mr. Thorne? Eleanor asked, her voice trembling slightly. Yes, it is. Who is this? My name is Eleanor. Lady Amelia sent me. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Lady Amelia, eh? Mr. Thorne said, his voice taking on a more respectful tone. What can I do for you? Eleanor took a deep breath. I need your help to get rid of a boy, she said, her voice barely a whisper. Mr. Thorne raised an eyebrow. A boy? What's he done to you? Eleanor hesitated. She couldn't reveal the truth to a stranger. He's a threat to my family, she said vaguely. A threat, huh? Mr. Thorne mused. Well, I can take care of that, but it won't be cheap. Eleanor didn't hesitate. I don't care about the cost, she said. I just want him gone. Mr. Thorne chuckled. Good. I like a woman who knows what she wants. Now tell me about this boy. Eleanor described Edward Jr. in detail, giving Mr. Thorne his full name, age, and where he was currently living. Excellent, Mr. Thorne said. I'll have one of my men look into him. Once I have more information, I'll let you know what I can do. Eleanor thanked Mr. Thorne and hung up the phone. She felt a surge of relief. She had finally found someone who could help her get rid of Edward Jr. Eleanor's heart pounded with a mixture of excitement and dread. She had hired Mr. Thorne to take care of Edward Jr., and she was eager to see the plan come to fruition. But she also knew that she had to be careful. If anyone suspected her of having a hand in Edward Jr.'s disappearance, she would be ruined. To cover her tracks, Eleanor began to act more loving and friendly towards Edward Jr. She spent more time with him, praised his accomplishments, and even offered to help him with his homework. At first, Edward Jr. was suspicious. He had never seen his stepmother so affectionate before. But over time, he began to relax and enjoy her company. Eleanor's deception was working. No one suspected her of having anything to do with the mysterious disappearance of Edward Jr. One day, as Eleanor lay awake in bed, she heard a knock at the door. She froze, her heart pounding in her chest. Who could it be at this hour? Gathering her courage, she got up and opened the door. To her horror, she found Mr. Thorne standing there. It's done, he said, his voice low and menacing. Eleanor's blood ran cold. What do you mean? She asked, her voice trembling. Edward Jr. is gone, Mr. Thorne replied. Forever! Eleanor's mind raced. She had finally gotten rid of Edward Jr. As Eleanor watched Mr. Thorne leave, she realized that her victory was hollow. She had achieved her goal and was filled with a sense of relief and satisfaction. Juliet's heart ached with grief as she mourned the loss of her son. The weeks turned into a month, and the pain of his absence only deepened. The castle, once filled with laughter and the joy of a growing family, now felt like a tomb. Every corner held a memory of her son, and every day was a constant reminder of his loss. One evening, Juliet approached Edward, her eyes filled with tears. "I can't stay here anymore," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Every room, every corner, reminds me of Edward Jr." Edward's heart ached for her. He knew how much she loved her son, and he understood her desire to escape the pain. "Of course, Juliet," he said gently. "You can leave whenever you want." Juliet thanked him, her voice filled with gratitude. She knew that leaving the castle would be difficult, but she also knew that it was the only way to find peace. A few days later, Juliet packed her belongings and left the castle. As she drove away, she glanced back one last time, her heart heavy with sorrow. She would never forget her son, and she would always cherish the time they had spent together. Eleanor, meanwhile, watched her departure with a sense of satisfaction. She had finally gotten rid of her rival, and now she had Edward all to herself. As she stood on the balcony, watching Juliet's car disappear into the distance, a smile crept across her face. Her plan had worked perfectly. Years passed, and Edward's health began to decline. His once vibrant spirit was dimmed by illness, and his once strong body was frail. As he lay on his deathbed, he reflected on his life, filled with regret and longing. One day, as Edward lay peacefully, Mr. Thorne appeared at his bedside. The two men had developed a deep bond over the years, and Mr. Thorne had become more than just a hired hand. "I have something to tell you, Edward," Mr. Thorne said, his voice filled with emotion. Edward looked up, his eyes filled with curiosity. "What is it?" he asked. Mr. Thorne hesitated. "Remember when your son disappeared?" Edward nodded. The memory was still fresh in his mind. "I never told you this, but I was involved," Mr. Thorne confessed. "Eleanor hired me to get rid of Edward Jr." Edward's eyes widened in shock. "Why?" he asked, his voice trembling. Mr. Thorne explained Eleanor's plan, revealing her jealousy and her desire to secure her son's inheritance. "But I didn't carry out her plan," Mr. Thorne continued. "I couldn't bring myself to harm a child. Instead, I arranged for Edward Jr. to be hidden away, safe and sound, because I know that your wife could kill him eventually if I had refused her request." Edward was overwhelmed with emotion. He had believed that his son was dead, and now he learned that he was alive. As Edward lay dying, he made a decision. He would ensure that his son would inherit his empire, not Eleanor. He called for his lawyer and dictated his will, leaving everything to Edward Jr. and Juliet. When Edward passed away, the news of his will sent shockwaves through the family. Eleanor, who had believed that she would inherit everything, was devastated. She had lost the fortune she thought would belong to her son. It was also discovered that Eleanor's son was never Sir Edward's biological child. As for Edward Jr. and Juliet, they returned to the castle, their lives forever changed. They had lost a loved one, but they had also gained a new beginning. And as they stood together, looking out over the vast estate, they knew that their future was bright. Thank you for watching. Kindly subscribe and stay tuned for more interesting stories.